Hello again, guys, welcome back. This is Comic Kid here again, and today we are looking at Superman Returns from director Bryan Singer and under Warner Brothers Studios. Now, this movie came out in 2006, and at the time that it launched, it received some rather mixed reviews. Serving as a direct sequel to the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, this one definitely kind of had a lot to live up to, and a lot of people kind of debate that wasn't necessarily the best route to go. Many feel as though the movie were weighed down by some odd creative choices, rather poor pacing, and some significant lack of actual action sequences. Now, despite the okay-ish reviews that the movie received overall, and I do believe it actually did pretty well at the box office, it did not perform well enough to get a sequel. Now, even though this movie did come between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, coming before The Dark Knight and Iron Man did kind of hurt its chances, in my opinion. The superhero movie genre hadn't quite found its footing, at least in the modern setting. And so despite Bryan Singer's success on the first two X-Men films, he just couldn't quite measure up on Superman Returns. But enough about the general bad stuff about the movie, let's get into some of the things that it actually gets right. And yes, before we get started, that is an absurdly small Superman Returns action figure. It is actually the only one I have of the movie, and it is far from the most detailed Superman action figure I have, and he scales poorly with the other two behind him, but I do think it's certainly a good thing to see how far we've come as far as action figure making goes, but let's jump in. Now, generally in each movie there's usually something you can say it does really well that kind of stands out or sets it apart from others in the genre. I actually had a pretty hard time doing that with Superman Returns. In general, it plays it safe, and because it's a sequel to the Christopher Reeve stuff, it does intentionally build on some of those elements, but it really doesn't do a whole lot to set it apart from other superhero movies. And that's not to say that it doesn't do some things better than others, we're gonna get to that. But the entire time I was watching this, I never really got the sense that it was really unique in any ways. Now, generally the cast is one of the strong points of the movie. I actually thought the cast could have been a lot better, but Kevin Spacey does still make for a pretty good Lex Luthor, especially building off of what Gene Hackman had established in the originals. Spacey really kind of brought a lot of similar charm and flair to the role while also making it his own. Now, of course, say what you will about Kevin Spacey as a person, but when you think of Lex Luthor and mention Kevin Spacey, it's definitely easy to see where they were coming from, as far as that casting decision goes. That said, Brandon Routh did make for a rather unconventional Superman choice. He really hadn't done much up until this point. He'd been in a lot of TV shows and only one or two movies beforehand, so despite the rather interesting choice there, I do think he'd have made for a better fit had they tweaked his look slightly. Maybe if they didn't give him such piercing blue eyes, or maybe a bit more natural looking hair, or maybe even a better suit, then I think Routh would have definitely fit the role a bit better, especially seeing him as Superman again in Crisis on Infinite Earths on the CW. You get the sense that Routh really had the potential to do a lot more with the Superman character. And then other cast members like Kate Bosworth and James Marsden did fine, but I do think there could have maybe been some better choices there. Maybe they would have done better with a better script, obviously, but Kevin Spacey is easily the biggest and strongest casting in the movie, in my opinion. Now, to move on from the casting, the plot itself isn't awful. There are definitely movies that have far worse plots. Everything in this movie just kind of feels so convenient. Lex Luthor just happens to be getting out of prison right as Superman gets back. And Superman himself has a son and Lois has moved on, and everything just kind of feels very convenient. Which, again, it's a movie, it is a work of fiction, that's understandable, but I do think they could have done a little bit better with the overall story. That said, it's still not awful. Lex Luthor actually has a pretty straightforward plan, and while a lot of people do complain about the whole real estate scheme on steroids aspect of it, it still makes sense. Lex Luthor would have all this advanced tech and all these new resources, and so he'd basically be untouchable despite the fact that he'd be killing billions of people. Again, that's up to debate as to what would actually go down in the real world, but it makes sense for the sake of the story. Now, if you can ignore some of the, convenience and, more forced aspects of the plot, everything else does actually kind of piece together pretty nicely. Obviously, the pacing itself could be improved upon, but from the blackout to Superman needing to come back to how Lois ends up on the boat, everything has its nice chronological order. It makes sense how certain details are discovered. It's not just Superman just used his hearing. It's no, Lois actually sent him some stuff through the fax machine, and everything does kind of make more sense in some ways than it does others. So while the plot certainly could use some improvement in and of itself overall, it's certainly also not the worst movie plot out there. Now, one of the other biggest things is in how Lois is portrayed. They did do some kind of tropey things that could have been a bit better for a more modern era, but Kate Bosworth's Lois Lane isn't entirely useless. She does make some rather questionable decisions, but throughout the film, she's not just always the damsel in distress. Obviously, there are still plenty of times where she needs Superman to save her, but it does do some good things in emphasizing that she is an investigative reporter and she's not just getting herself in all these bad situations just 'cause. Really, the only time she makes a huge mistake is when she takes her kid to Lex Luthor's yacht and just trespasses with her kid. That's really the only, far-fetched, really poor character decision made in her part. And so while there still could be some stuff that they could have done better with Lois Lane, they also didn't just rehash a lot of, old-school, super dated depictions of her character at the same time. Now, easily the movie's, biggest strength is probably at the end, after Superman lifts the continent into the air, and you do get some glimpses of this element, earlier in the film as well, especially right as Superman actually returns, with, the plane scene and all that, but the movie really understands this impact that Superman can have on the rest of the world, and when he comes back and you see the world's reaction, it really drives home the sense that Superman is a symbol, and while I think they totally could have and should have done more with that in this film, it is still nice to see the rest of the world react to Superman in this way. And especially after, he lifts the continent and falls back to Earth and he's in the hospital, seeing everyone just around the hospital or the news clips of people around the world reacting to the news really emphasizes what Superman means, not only to the DC Universe, but the entire world. And so again, they totally should have done more with this, but it was still a nice touch to see them actually incorporate into the film. And then one of the other biggest criticisms towards the film that I already mentioned is the fact that he never actually fights anyone. I would disagree with this criticism just because, in my opinion, that is entirely up for debate. What makes Superman such a great character is not that he can do all of this stuff, it's more in the character of Superman himself. He doesn't always need to throw a punch, sometimes he just needs to be there to save the day. And so just because he doesn't actually fight anyone directly in this movie, I wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad thing. Again, it still could have been better, and they definitely needed to incorporate something else, but I would not say more fight scenes, or I guess any fight scene, would have been the one thing this movie needed to improve it. I would disagree with some people in that aspect. Throughout the film, you see Superman helping people, and whether it's something super minor or something major, like Clark Kent is always there to do what he can. And so, while I wouldn't say that I liked the fact that he didn't fight anyone one-on-one, I do think it's not a bad thing for the film to take this approach. It felt more kind of like a disaster movie featuring Superman rather than an actual superhero movie in the traditional sense. And then, of course, you have the iconic John Williams Superman score. I love the fact that they brought it back. They used it very well throughout the film. It's such an iconic piece of music, and it's just part of Superman. Now, obviously, I do think it was wise for them to kind of depart from that for Man of Steel a few years later, but given that it is an actual sequel to the Christopher Reeve Superman stuff, like, you want this score. Now, the other elements of original music are still decent, but it's really that iconic John Williams score that brings the sense of nostalgia back into the film. Despite the fact that this movie is a sequel, there are so many unfamiliar elements to audiences from the Reeve era, and so this soundtrack or this particular score is easily the best way to capture this sense of nostalgia for the movie's audience. But that is everything I have for you guys today. Again, I feel like this video is a little bit shorter. It's not because there aren't good things to say about Superman Returns, but a lot of what it does good is pretty traditional and kind of bland, and so overall I wouldn't say I hated this movie, but of course, you know, it could have been a little bit better. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. Be sure to hit like and subscribe, and I will see you all again real soon.